The line at First Union Bank stretched nearly to the entrance. Customers grumbled in hushed tones, shifting impatiently on aching feet. But somehow only one woman was asked to step out of line. "Ma'am, we need to keep things moving," the teller said sharply. "Just wait over there, please." The woman blinked, once. Then, without a word, she moved aside. No one questioned it. Man behind her shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, not even the man directly behind her, who now stepped forward like nothing had happened. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but that one quiet dismissal echoed louder than any outburst. Comment number one if you've ever seen someone pushed aside like they didn't matter, and knew they deserved better. You don't want to miss what happens next. It was just another late Friday afternoon in the older part of New Orleans. The kind of day where tired hands held crumpled receipts and sore backs leaned against marble counters that never got any warmer. The First Union Bank branch, located just off Claiborne Avenue, had once been known for its friendly service. Now it was understaffed, overworked, and indifferent. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they too had grown weary. Every week, the same crowd came in, mostly retirees checking statements, withdrawing small amounts, questioning new fees they never remembered agreeing to. The staff had grown numb to them. And in that branch, on that day, a woman they thought was just another elderly face in the line would become the name everyone remembered. Mabel Sinclair, 74 years old, wore her years like silk. A long beige skirt brushed the top of her loafers, and her pale blue cardigan hugged shoulders shaped by decades of blackboard chalk and quiet courage. She wasn't loud. She never had been. Decades of teaching in underfunded schools had trained her in the art of waiting, of watching, of choosing when to speak so her voice would be heard. In her right hand, slightly trembling, she clutched an envelope with printed bank statements. In her left, a cloth handbag she'd sewn herself 30 years ago. There were no jewelry, no flashy accessories. Just her, straight-backed, tired-eyed, but unbroken. She had come to the bank to ask a simple question. But in that place, on that day, no one was interested in her questions. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's just how it is," the teller repeated. Her name tag read Ellen, and her fingers didn't pause as she tapped keys on the monitor. Mabel unfolded her papers carefully. "I've never seen these charges before. I've had this account for 30 years, and—" "It's in the terms and conditions," Ellen cut in, voice clipped. "You probably missed the notice, or maybe you got the email and didn't read it." People behind Mabel began shifting, sighing loudly. A man muttered something under his breath. The room's air grew tighter, heavier. Mabel looked down at the statement again. Small fees, $3.25 here, $7.90 there. But they added up. On her fixed pension, every dollar mattered. All she wanted was someone to look at the screen. Just look. But Ellen didn't look. She dismissed the envelope with a half smile that wasn't a smile at all. The manager, Raymond Grant, had seen the interaction from across the room. He crossed his arms and leaned against the frame of his office doorway, watching with the interest of someone observing a low-stakes game. He had been in banking for 20 years, and he had learned one thing. Time was money, and some people's time wasn't worth much. As Mabel's voice grew quieter, Raymond stepped forward. "Is there an issue here?" "No, sir," Ellen answered quickly, standing straighter. "Just a customer misunderstanding policy again." Mabel turned toward him. "I only want someone to review these. I haven't missed a payment, and my balance—" Raymond raised a hand. "Ma'am, the system is automated. If it says the fees are valid, they are." That was the rule, and rules, he believed, were meant to keep people like Mabel from wasting his time. Then came the moment. Raymond leaned over the counter, not whispering, but raising his voice just enough for the room to hear. "If you can't maintain the minimum balance, maybe this bank isn't the right place for you." A silence fell so sharp it could cut. Ellen froze. Customers turned, some pretending they hadn't heard, others too stunned to react. No one said a word. No one moved. Mabel's hands curled tightly around the envelope. Her eyes didn't water, but her breath caught in her chest like a held-in question. She had been teaching kids like Ellen how to read before Ellen was even born. Now she was being spoken to like a burden. Mabel didn't shout. She didn't beg. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she did something that made the room colder than Raymond's words ever could. She stood up straight. She looked directly at him, not with defiance, but with the kind of clarity that made people uneasy, the kind that came from having lived longer than most of them had been alive. And then she turned her gaze toward the others in line. Not accusing, just waiting, waiting to see if anyone else would speak up. They didn't. From the far corner, someone shifted. A young man in a hoodie, Deshaun, slowly raised his phone. He wasn't part of this story yet, but he would be. And from that quiet corner, his camera began to roll, capturing the beginning of something no one inside that bank would be able to erase. Mabel stood alone at the side of the lobby, still clutching her envelope. No chair was offered, no one made space. The space around her felt designed to keep her standing. The same employees who smiled at wealthier clients barely glanced her way, and when a tall, suited man passed by holding coffee, he muttered under his breath, "Why don't they just use online banking?" She heard him, and still she stood, in that sterile room built for finance, where everything had a process, and every person a number. The only thing not accounted for was dignity. Comment number 1 if you've ever watched someone be ignored like they didn't exist, when they were the only one showing grace. You won't want to miss what happens next. The first union branch was deceptively elegant. Brushed chrome signage, minimalist seating, and a customer service flow model designed for efficiency. But in truth, it was a place built for some and endured by others. Older Black clients like Mabel were regulars. But unlike the suited business people who were ushered into private glass offices, they waited, always waited, and always standing. The room was full now, mid-afternoon Friday, families with kids, nurses in scrubs, construction workers with worn hands, all inching through a system that treated them like afterthoughts. Mabel's presence was noted by no one. Her cardigan, her quiet posture, her slow breath, they didn't signal urgency to the staff trained to prioritize noise and numbers, but she was still there, watching, remembering, gathering. At exactly 3:07 p.m., Raymond Grant emerged from his glass-walled office. Branch manager, mid-50s, impeccable charcoal gray suit, burgundy tie, and a haircut so precise it made him look like a news anchor. He carried himself like someone who had never waited in line a day in his life. To the staff, he was firm but efficient. To customers like Mabel, he was distant, corporate to the bone. He scanned the lobby like he was measuring productivity in steps and size. His eyes passed over Mabel just briefly, then dismissed her. Raymond had a system: prioritize VIPs, control perception, and never ever appear unsure. When he noticed the teller, Ellen, glancing nervously at the side desk where Mabel stood, he moved. Not to help, but to manage optics. "What's going on here?" Raymond asked, his voice neutral but loud enough to carry. Ellen straightened. "Just a customer with account questions again." Raymond glanced at Mabel with professional disinterest. "Ma'am, did someone already explain our policy regarding minimum balances?" Mabel met his eyes calmly. "Yes, but no one's actually reviewed my account. I've had it for over 30 years, and these fees only began recently." He smiled thinly. "Yes, ma'am, but we've updated policy. It's all automatic now." And then, as if she wasn't standing right there, he turned back to Ellen and muttered, "People like this show up every week thinking the rules don't apply." It was quiet, but not quiet enough. The words landed like a slap across marble. The air shifted. The woman in scrubs in line blinked. A grandfather leaning on his cane frowned. Someone near the exit stopped scrolling their phone. Mabel didn't move, didn't flinch, but her hand tightened around the strap of her bag. Raymond, already walking away, didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. To him it was nothing, just an expression. Just a way to reassert control in a room full of people he thought beneath his paycheck. To everyone else, something had cracked open, something not easily covered back up. That was when a low voice broke the tension. Did he really just say that out loud? The voice belonged to Deshawn, seated quietly in a corner with his phone half out of his pocket. He stood now, hoodie pulled down, face calm but firm. You really just said people like this in front of a room full of black customers, huh? Raymond turned, instantly defensive. Excuse me? Ellen's eyes darted toward the exit. Mabel still hadn't moved. She was watching, not Raymond, but the people around her. Deshawn walked forward a few steps. You talk to her like she's disposable, then try to brush it off? I hope someone's recording this. Another customer, a middle-aged woman, raised her phone without saying a word. Raymond looked around, and for the first time, realized he had lost the room. In all this, Mabel never raised her voice, never stepped out of her calm, measured presence. She simply turned to Ellen, who now looked small behind her monitor, and said, "All I asked for was clarity." Her voice was soft, not shaken, not begging, just real. That moment, quieter than Deshawn's protest, softer than the rustle of a jacket, held more power than anything Raymond had said all day. Even the customers in line seemed to stand taller, as if Mabel's dignity somehow extended to them too. And still, no chair was offered. As Deshawn spoke louder, someone near the entrance turned their head toward the lobby doors. A man had just entered. He wore a black t-shirt, jeans, and a cap pulled low over his face. He paused briefly, took in the room, and then began walking forward with purpose. No one recognized him, not yet. But Mabel noticed his shoes, dusty, worn in, not the shoes of a man who came to be seen, but of someone who came to act. And just as Ellen opened her mouth to speak again, that man's voice cut through the air. Why are you talking to her like that? Mabel didn't know who he was, but something about the way he walked, the heaviness in his step, felt familiar. Not from sight, but from silence. From years of being overlooked and knowing who would not let it happen again. The room froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a slow blade, clear, calm, and unshakably firm. Why are you talking to her like that? Every eye turned toward the entrance. A man in a black t-shirt, jeans, and a worn cap stood just inside the door. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. But suddenly, he owned the room. For a second, no one recognized him, but no one dared interrupt. Comment number 1: if you've ever wished someone, anyone, would speak up when no one else would. Because what happens next will change everything. The atmosphere inside First Union had been heavy all day. The fluorescent lights, the mechanical beeps of ATMs, the shuffle of irritated feet, everything had built to this moment of unspoken pressure. But now, with that one question, the weight shifted. Raymond stood mid-step, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Ellen froze behind her terminal, the cursor blinking endlessly on her screen. Customers who had once looked away now leaned in, curious. And Mabel? She stood where she had always stood, dignified, calm, her hand still resting on the edge of the counter, but her eyes moved to the doorway. She didn't smile, she didn't flinch, but for the first time all day she felt seen. The man took a step forward. He removed his cap slowly, and then the gasps came. Wait, is that who I think it is? Yes, it was Terrence Duvall, acclaimed producer, quiet philanthropist, known for creating films that honored the dignity of Black history and exposing the quiet injustices hidden in everyday systems. He wasn't dressed like power, but he carried it. He didn't look at the cameras or wave at the whispers. He looked at Mabel, only her. Then he turned back to Raymond, his tone even. I asked a question. Why are you speaking to her like that? Raymond straightened. Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but this is none of your business. This is a banking matter. Terrence raised an eyebrow, taking another measured step forward. I didn't say it was a matter of money, he said. I said it was a matter of respect. Raymond's jaw tightened. Look, this woman doesn't meet the minimum requirements for her account. That's policy. Terrence tilted his head. Or maybe it's just convenient to shame someone who won't fight back. The murmur in the crowd grew. Ellen shifted in her seat. Deshawn, now filming without hiding it, whispered, "It's on." The camera was rolling, and the truth had just stepped into the frame. Terrence turned to Mabel. His voice softened, but didn't lose its strength. "Ma'am, can you show me what you're asking about?" Mabel hesitated, just a moment, then handed him the envelope with the careful, deliberate grace of someone who had been handing out papers her entire life. Terrence flipped through them quickly, the line of deductions, the pattern of fees, the shift in policy. Then he turned to Ellen. "Can you pull up her account?" Ellen glanced at Raymond, who glared. "She can," Terrence said before she could answer. "If everything's by the book, no one should have anything to hide." His words weren't aggressive. They were surgical. Raymond swallowed hard. The game had changed. Ellen tapped her keyboard with trembling fingers. The screen loaded slowly, long enough for every second to stretch thin. Terrence leaned in. The fees had started 2 months ago, and not just on Mabel's account. He turned back toward the crowd. "How many of you have had accounts here for over 5 years?" Hands went up. "How many of you saw new charges around the same time?" More hands. Dozens. He looked back at Raymond. "This isn't about one account. This is about a system targeting the people least likely to question it. That's not a clerical error, that's a design. And designs like this don't happen by accident." The silence in the room now wasn't passive. It was electric. Raymond's palms began to sweat. Terrence took a step closer. "You're going to reverse those charges, for her, and for everyone else affected." Raymond scoffed, but it came out weak. "And if I don't?" Terrence's voice dropped half a register. "Then I'd love to hear you explain to corporate why your branch went viral for defrauding elderly customers." The word viral made Raymond glance toward Deshawn's camera. Terrence smiled faintly. "Don't worry, they'll see the full video." Raymond opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Ellen looked at the screen, then at Mabel, then quietly she began typing. Refunds processed, screenshots saved. Mabel didn't say a word. She didn't have to. As Ellen hit the final keystroke, Terrence nodded once, toward Mabel, not the crowd. "I didn't come here to make a scene," he said, "but sometimes silence is the most dangerous thing in the room." He picked up his cap, dusted it once, and placed it back on his head. Deshawn kept filming as Terrence walked out the door, leaving only the echo of his presence behind. But for Mabel, something had already shifted. Not because someone famous had spoken for her, but because someone had recognized she never stopped speaking for herself. Even in silence, she had been teaching the room what strength looked like. And finally, someone listened. Terrence didn't blink, didn't raise his voice. He simply gestured to the monitor behind the counter and said, "Go ahead. Pull up her account." Ellen froze. Raymond's face stiffened and his fingers curled against his palm. He looked at the room. Every pair of eyes now locked on that screen. "If you're so sure it's all correct," Terrence said again, "there shouldn't be a problem showing it." The silence deepened, not a silence of confusion, but of expectation. Comment number 1 if you believe sometimes the most powerful thing in the room is the truth finally being seen. You won't believe what shows up on that screen. The bank lobby no longer buzzed with casual annoyance. It pulsed with stillness. Deshawn's camera was still rolling, steady in his hand. Customers had stopped shifting in line. Some leaned closer, some whispered to each other. But no one left. Even the security guard, usually standing off to the side, had inched nearer, uncertain whether to intervene or just observe. It wasn't just about Mabel anymore. It had become a moment of reckoning, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet unfolding of accountability in a place that had gotten used to never being questioned. The monitor glowed, waiting, and so did everyone else. Ellen Hart had once believed she was just following policy. She had memorized the scripts, internalized the rules, and moved through each day with the numbness of someone who believed, this is just how the system works. But now her hands hovered uncertainly over the keyboard. She wasn't just dealing with numbers anymore. She was staring into the face of a woman who could have been her grandmother, and next to her, a man whose voice had shifted the balance of power in the room. Raymond cleared his throat behind her. Go on, he muttered, but his voice had lost its edge. It was Ellen's choice now, and for the first time that day, she typed. Mabel didn't move, but something softened in her jaw, like she had waited years for someone, anyone, to finally put truth on record. The account history unfolded on screen, line by line, glowing against the sterile blue background. Ellen scrolled, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Terrence leaned in, arms crossed. Looks like her balance never fell below the threshold, he said calmly. Not once in the last 6 months. Raymond stepped closer. There might have been an internal adjustment. No, Ellen interrupted quietly. There wasn't. Her voice was small but final. Mabel said nothing. She just stood there, her hands clasped gently over her bag. She didn't need to speak. The screen spoke for her. Terrence's eyes remained on the data. These fees began 2 months ago, right after a system update. Ellen nodded reluctantly. They adjusted the terms on certain accounts, especially older ones with legacy status. Terrence looked back at the crowd. Legacy accounts, like hers. He turned to Raymond. Tell me, when you implemented that change, did you inform your long-term clients? Raymond's jaw clenched. It was part of the online notice, Deshawn interjected. You think my grandma checks her email every morning like it's Twitter? A few people chuckled bitterly. Terrence didn't smile. You created a trap disguised as a policy update and hoped they wouldn't notice. And they almost didn't. Almost. Terrence turned back toward the room. How many of you noticed strange new fees in the last 2 months? Hands rose. First 3, then 6, then over a dozen. Elderly, middle-aged. One young woman holding a child raised hers too. Terrence looked at Raymond. You seeing what I'm seeing? Raymond's face had gone pale. This isn't systemic, it's isolated. No, Terrence replied. What's isolated is your sense of consequence. He stepped forward. This wasn't an oversight, this was a strategy, targeting the people least likely to fight back. The silence this time was no longer surrender, it was pressure, steady, ancient, and building like a storm long overdue. Raymond opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked to Ellen. She didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she began clicking again. One by one, she navigated through refund menus. Charges reversed, lines corrected, records amended. Terrence stepped back, letting the screen speak louder than he ever could. Deshawn whispered into the mic of his phone, She's getting her money back. So are others. Behind him, someone muttered, Finally. Mabel watched the screen, blinking slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She simply nodded, as if reclaiming something that had never been anyone else's to take. As Ellen processed the last refund, a faint notification popped up at the corner of the screen. Internal flag. Management review. Pending. Terrence raised an eyebrow. Looks like the system is watching now, too. Raymond scoffed, trying to reassert control. This will all blow over. Terrence turned to him slowly. Number it won't, because someone had filmed it, because dozens had witnessed it, because a woman who had been ignored had now become the face of quiet resistance. As Terrence turned to leave, he paused beside Mabel. You didn't need a voice, he said gently. You were the reason one showed up. And in that brief moment, her silence became the most eloquent answer the room had ever heard. She smiled, for the first time, and the next chapter had already begun. Raymond spun toward Deshawn, his voice sharp. Turn that off, now. Deshawn didn't flinch. He held his phone steady, screen glowing. You're too late, he said. It's already live. Raymond's face drained of color. The casual confidence he wore like a second skin shattered. This wasn't just a customer complaint anymore. It was a public reckoning. Comment number 1 if you believe the truth always finds its way, especially when someone's been filming the whole time. What unravels next can't be deleted. The First Union lobby was no longer a place of routine. It had become a stage, and the show wasn't being run by the branch manager anymore. Customers whispered in corners. Phones were pulled out, not for banking apps, but for live feeds and screenshots. A teenager near the front quietly said, "It's trending." Ellen sat behind her monitor, hands still on the keyboard, unsure whether to keep clicking or back away. Mabel stood where she always had, still composed but no longer alone. Behind her, the weight of the room had shifted, and Raymond Grant felt it bearing down on him. Deshawn had never planned to be the center of anything that day. He came in for a routine deposit, but he'd recognized Mabel the moment he saw her. She was his elementary school teacher, the woman who taught him how to read when he could barely sit still, the one who bought him lunch out of her own pocket when his family couldn't afford it. He hadn't said anything when she walked in, but when he saw her dismissed, then humiliated, something in him snapped. So he pulled out his phone, not to go viral, but to make sure she wouldn't be erased. Raymond lunged toward Deshawn, his voice cracking. "Delete it, or I'll call security." The room tensed. Even the security guard paused, unsure where to side. Deshawn stood his ground. "Go ahead, call them. I'm filming in a public place. No one signed NDAS." Terrence had stayed silent until now, but he stepped forward again, calm as ever. "Careful," he said to Raymond. "You're already being watched by more than just the people in this room." Raymond looked around and saw it. Every eye on him, every camera pointed his way. This wasn't a branch anymore, it was a trial. Deshawn looked straight at Raymond. "You said, people like her show up every week." "Say it again. Let them hear you." Raymond's mouth opened, then closed. Someone from the crowd muttered, "Say it now." Ellen looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Deshawn continued, "You think because she's older and quiet, no one would stand up? You think we'd just let it slide?" He held up his phone. "But not this time." Mabel didn't speak. She didn't have to. The room was already doing it for her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told to stay silent. Terrence turned toward Ellen. "You've started processing refunds. Finish them." Ellen hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, she resumed typing. Every keystroke echoed in the tense silence. Raymond took a step forward. "You don't have the authority." "You already lost your authority," Terrence said coldly, "when you used it to humiliate someone instead of help them." Deshawn added, "We're not asking anymore. We're watching." One by one, phones rose like a silent jury, each lens a witness, each hand a verdict. Raymond didn't just freeze, he cracked. On screen, rows of reversed charges blinked into place. Mabel's first, then others. The crowd didn't cheer. They just watched. Because justice, when it finally comes, doesn't need to announce itself. It just happens. Mabel's balance now reflected what it should have been. Ellen nodded at her, voice barely audible. "It's done." Mabel offered a quiet nod in return. No smile, no tears. Just dignity reclaimed. Deshawn lowered his phone. "They're going to want more than refunds," he said to no one in particular. Terrence looked at Raymond, who stood in silent defeat. "You'll apologize," he said firmly. "Properly. And publicly." Raymond swallowed hard. I apologize." "To whom?" Terrence asked. Raymond looked at Mabel. "To Mrs. Sinclair, for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable." And somehow that single line held more weight than any transaction that day. As Raymond stepped back, the sound of a phone chimed, then another, and another. Customers glanced down. Their eyes widened. Deshaun checked his feed. "It's on every major platform already," he whispered. The video had spread. Comments were pouring in. Raymond turned toward Ellen. "Shut it down." She didn't move. Then she said, without looking up, "Sir, it's too late." Terrence stepped back, glancing at Mabel one last time. "You didn't ask for any of this, but sometimes the right moment finds the right person." He turned and walked toward the exit. Mabel looked around and saw every phone still pointed at her. But for once, she didn't feel exposed. She felt heard. Raymond's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he knew who it was. He turned pale, stepped behind the counter, and answered with forced calm. "Yes, this is Raymond Grant speaking." A clipped voice responded coldly, "Mr. Grant, we need to speak. Now." Behind him, the lobby still buzzed with quiet murmurs. Deshaun's phone continued recording. The customers hadn't left. They were waiting for something more. Comment number 1 if you've ever seen a moment when silence held more power than yelling ever could. Because now the consequences come knocking. The branch had become eerily quiet. The line was gone, but no one had left. People stood scattered around the room watching, not because they had business, but because they wanted justice to finish what it started. Screens glowed with the viral video now trending on multiple platforms. Headlines flashed, "Elderly Black woman, humiliated at bank, stranger intervenes." Corporate review launched at First Union after viral incident. Behind the scenes, emails were firing across departments. Flags were triggered, PR teams scrambled. And in that small New Orleans branch, a man who had once ruled the lobby now stood exposed. Raymond didn't know what was worse, the silence in the room, or the line going dead on the phone after corporate said, "You'll be hearing from us again." Ellen Hart stood behind her desk, arms crossed. She didn't know what to do with her hands anymore. Typing was over. Small talk was over. Scripts were useless. Raymond had always been a shield, cold but predictable. Now he looked like a man trying to plug holes in a sinking ship with his bare hands. Ellen glanced at Mabel, who still hadn't moved far from the counter. And for the first time, she saw something she hadn't before, not fragility, but fortitude. Mabel didn't need a manager. She didn't need noise. She had stood in one place and made an empire shake. Raymond threw his phone on the desk, voice shaking. "They're choosing her over me, a customer who didn't even meet the minimums." Ellen turned. She was never the problem. Raymond glared. "You think corporate cares about truth? They care about damage control. That video just cost me everything." He was unraveling, the once commanding voice now cracked, bitter. Deshaun recorded from a discreet angle, capturing every line. Ellen finally spoke louder. "You said that line about people like her, out loud, in front of all of us. Maybe that's what cost you everything." Raymond looked stunned. Not that she said it, but that she finally had. The room flinched at the sound of Ellen's voice rising. "I think we should report this," she said again, this time directly to the security guard. Raymond spun around. "You would really do that to me?" Ellen's voice shook, but she didn't back down. "You told us to start charging those fees. You said no one would notice, that we should prioritize high-value clients." Deshaun's phone caught every word. "I was just following your lead," she finished. Raymond scoffed. "You were happy to follow it when your bonus depended on it." But the tension now wasn't about bonuses, it was about truth coming to collect. The first wave of notifications hit everyone's phones at once. Buzz. Ding. Buzz. Deshaun looked down and smiled. The video's been shared over 10,000 times already. Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, it's everywhere. Raymond snatched his own phone, his name, his face, his voice, immortalized in a moment of arrogance. He turned to Ellen. "Delete the system logs. Shut it down." She didn't move. "You think this is fixable?" she asked. "You think this is something you can hide in a report?" He didn't answer. because now he was finally starting to understand. It wasn't just about him anymore. Raymond looked at Mabel. Her face was calm, not victorious, not angry, just still. He walked over slowly. The lobby watched in dead silence. I apologize, Mrs. Sinclair, he said, for the misunderstanding. Terrence had returned from the far end of the lobby, arms crossed. That's not an apology. Raymond sighed, defeated. I apologize for the way you were treated. It was wrong. You were disrespected. And it won't happen again. Mabel nodded once. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. The room had heard. So had the world. And his seat of power had already crumbled. Later that afternoon, Raymond walked into his office and closed the door behind him. He looked at the leather chair behind his desk, the one no one else ever sat in. He had always believed it meant something, that it stood for control, for accomplishment, for status. Now it looked like a costume that no longer fit. He sat down once more, back straight, breath held. Outside, Deshaun uploaded the final video segment, and Ellen sent a message to corporate. We need to talk about Mr. Grant. That chair might still be there tomorrow, but Raymond wouldn't be. The envelope came 3 days later. It was simple. No logo, no return address. Just Mabel's name written in clean block letters, slightly slanted, like someone had taken their time. Inside was a single handwritten note. No email, no legal jargon. Just this. You didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you. Terrence folded beneath it a printed invitation. Private screening, advance premiere. The ones who stayed standing, comment number 1. If you believe the strongest people are often the ones who never ask to be recognized, but still change everything. And wait until you see how her story truly ends. It was early morning. The sun filtered through pale curtains, painting the small kitchen in soft gold. A kettle whistled gently. The radio murmured an old jazz track from a forgotten decade. Mabel sat at her kitchen table wearing the same cardigan she had worn to the bank. But she looked different now. Not younger, not louder, just lighter. The newspaper sat untouched. Her eyes lingered on the note again, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope as if testing whether it was real. It was. And so was the quiet victory stitched into every word. She hadn't left the house much since the video. There'd been messages, calls, even 2 reporters who showed up at her door, which she politely declined. Mabel wasn't interested in noise. She had spent her entire life doing the kind of work people forget to thank you for, raising minds, feeding kids who weren't hers, showing up early, staying late. She didn't need to trend. She didn't need to trend. But what she needed, and finally got, was acknowledgement. Not for being a victim, but for being someone who never stopped showing up, even when no one else did. On the TV across the kitchen, a news anchor spoke gently. Following the viral video, First Union has officially removed branch manager Raymond Grant from his position. Sources say a broader audit is now underway. A picture of Raymond flashed across the screen, followed by Mabel's still image from the original footage. She blinked, not in satisfaction, but in remembrance. She didn't hate him. She just hoped he'd remember what it felt like to be humbled, not because he was wrong, but because next time, he might choose better. A soft knock on the door. Mabel stood slowly and opened it. 3 kids stood outside, neighborhood children, 2 holding plastic lunchboxes, the smallest one carrying a crumpled notebook. Miss Sinclair? The tallest asked shyly. My mama said you used to teach reading. Mabel tilted her head. I did. He held up the notebook. Could you maybe help me with this story? She looked at them for a long moment, then stepped aside. Well then, she said. Come on in. Let's see what you've got. The world hadn't changed overnight, but the next generation had just walked through her door. The children sat at the same table where Mabel had read Terrence's letter. Pencils clattered. A juice box tipped over. A sentence was sounded out. syllable by syllable. It wasn't loud, it wasn't triumphant, but it was a return to something real. The table wasn't fancy, the chairs didn't match. But here, in this small kitchen, a legacy was unfolding. And unlike the bank that once made her stand, here, everyone had a seat. Later that afternoon, Mabel sat alone again. The kids had gone, their voices still echoing faintly in her memory. She picked up the invitation once more. The film premiere, Terrence's handwritten note. She smiled, not because she wanted the spotlight, but because she knew what that screening would show the world. Not her weakness, but her quiet refusal to be erased. That night, she placed the note in a wooden box with old photos. Students, school certificates, letters from parents. She didn't need a medal or a statue, but she finally understood what it meant to be seen. And that was enough. As she turned off the kitchen light, the camera lingered on the chair at the table, the one she always gave up for others. This time, it stayed empty, not because she wasn't welcome in it, but because she'd already earned every seat she ever stood beside. Some people win by standing at the front of the room. Others win by refusing to leave when they're told they don't belong. Mabel Sinclair didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her fists. She didn't demand attention. But she made the system stop and look at her. For many older women, especially Black women, the world has taught us that being quiet means being invisible, that if we don't shout, no one will listen, that dignity is weakness. But this story reminds us dignity is a kind of strength that systems can't prepare for. To every woman who's been dismissed, overlooked, or told she's too old, too much, or not enough, this is your story too. It's for the teacher who gave more than she earned, the mother who worked 2 jobs and still made it to church on Sunday, the grandmother who raised whole generations without ever being thanked. And it's a reminder that even when the world forgets you, you don't have to forget who you are. Because sometimes the smallest act of standing still is what finally makes everything else move.